So good evening, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and start. Welcome and thank you for coming out on a cold and snowy night to participate in the University of Montana's activities marking the Martin Luther King Day. Some of you may have noticed that the King Day holiday actually was a couple of weeks ago, but since the university wasn't in session, we decide year after year not to do anything during that time when the students aren't here and wait until schools in session to begin the university's activities marking the King holiday. And I think it's appropriate because after all, that's what universities are about. Universities are here to educate. And I think it's especially fitting that the university honor the memory of Martin Luther King Jr. by engaging in serious discussions of King, the movement he led, and their meaning for American society. And in that light, I want to call to your attention yet another event, and that is this Friday. The Martin Luther King Day Committee will sponsor the showing of a documentary on the murder of Emmett Till. It will be shown in the University Center atrium, and it'll be on all throughout the day. So if you want to go and sit and watch, it's a segmented documentary, it's in pieces. You're certainly invited. I hope you'll join in that as well. Tonight's talk is sponsored by the Martin Luther King Day Committee, supported by President Dennison. And I want to thank the President's Office, the Martin Luther King Day Committee for their work. Ray Carlisle coordinated our efforts with the community activities on the King holiday on the 15th. Dar Taknat arranged for showing the documentary in the University Center. And Jeff Wiltsing, my colleague in the History Department, helped in all sorts of different ways, and I really do appreciate that, Jeff. And a special thanks to Char Bonebright, who went just way, way above the call of duty, and she's been unbelievably helpful and cheerful in doing so, and wherever you are, thanks, there you are, thanks, Char, very much. In fact, if it weren't for her, we'd probably be meeting in a room with no lights, and our speaker would be in either Denver or Salt Lake somewhere. It's an honor, really, to have tonight's speaker as part of our King Day celebration. Stephen Lawson is one of the foremost historians of civil rights in the modern era and the civil rights movement. He's an accomplished scholar who spent a career studying black voting rights, the civil rights movement, and related topics. After earning his BA at City College of New York, he did his MA at Columbia University and his PhD at Columbia in 1974, a long time ago. He's taught at the University of South Florida, University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and since 1998 at Rutgers University. It would take far more time than I intend to take tonight to mention all the books he's published, but let me call a couple of them to your attention because I think they're worth it. Stephen first made his mark in 1976 with Black Ballots, Voting Rights in the South from 1944 to 1969, a book from which I've stolen much material for lectures. He followed that in 1987 with In Pursuit of Power, Southern Blacks and Electoral Politics from 1965 to 1982. And I see at least several people in the audience who are very familiar with his book, Running for Freedom, Civil Rights and Black Politics in America since 1941. More recently, in 2003, he published an engaging study, Civil Rights Crossroads, Nation, Community, and the Black Freedom Struggle. His articles have appeared in a wide variety of journals, including, to name just a few, the Journal of Negro History, The Historian, Southern Studies, and the American Historical Review. And above all, he was kind enough to come all the way from New Jersey to share his views with us tonight. His topic is, how much difference did the Voting Rights Act make, black ballots in the civil rights movement? And please join me in giving a warm welcome on a cold night to Stephen Lawson. This is something of a new tradition. For speakers on the Martin Luther King Day holiday. We're making you an honorary Grizzly.
A Grizzly.
So,
Go Grizz.
I've lost my speak.
Thank you. Okay, if you just bear with me a second. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Mike for having invited me in the first place and reminding me how old I am. I must be old if I did all the things he claimed I did over the course of my career. And Char Bonebright, who I had not met until about a half hour ago, who works in the president's office, is a real credit to your university in that she makes people from the other side of the Rockies, Mississippi, feel welcome. Absolutely marvelous in getting me here when I was supposed to get here. And the members of the history department whom I've met, I thank you as well. I see a number of students, I assume undergraduates. I hope your professors are giving you extra credit for coming here. That's usually the reason why undergraduates come to see speakers they've never heard of. So I hope you're getting something out of it beyond my talk. It's about a 40 to 45 minute talk, so make yourselves comfortable. I'll try to be informative. I'm so pleased, really. This is not a talk about Martin Luther King per se, although his presence infuses this talk. But I'm so honored to have my name connected with Dr. King, who has really gone up and down in historical fashion. But for those of us who had the privilege of living in the era in which he did and who have studied his life, we are fortunate to have been able to do that, but we are unfortunate, and we all are unfortunate in this country, not to have his voice at a time in our history when his voice would be welcome and needed. Last August the 6th, 2006, marked the 40th anniversary of passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, justly acclaimed as the most successful piece of legislation during the modern civil rights era. This commemoration came at a bittersweet time. On a positive note, today, a large number of African Americans hold elective office throughout the country and in Congress, and they also occupy significant cabinet-level posts in Washington. First, Colin Powell and then Condoleezza Rice have served as Secretary of State, a position once held by Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and perhaps ironically, John C. Calhoun. At the same time, and in a more troubling vein, this anniversary arrived amidst a fractured consensus over the correct definition of political equality in a pluralistic nation and the increasing unwillingness to count black votes and make them count. Furthermore, Secretaries of State Powell and Rice contributed to the Bush administration's launching of a war in Iraq that has cost the United States over 3,000 lives, as well as precious economic resources that could be directed toward needed social programs at home. Looking back 4 decades, it's easy enough to see how much has changed. But as with most issues involving race throughout American history, it is also easy to see how contested the results have been. We must keep in mind several points before assessing what has happened over the past 40 years. First, it's important to remember that how much had changed, since 1965. When even a decade of litigation in the federal courts, white Southern officials still found ways to resist and slow down voter registration to a snail's pace. Dr. Martin Luther King wryly commented that at a rate the registrars in one Alabama county were conducting business, he said this in 1965, quote, "It would take about 103 years to register adult Negroes. On the eve of passage of the Voting Rights Act, political apartheid existed in the South. Nearly all elected officials were white. Not a single African American represented a Southern jurisdiction in Congress. None served as governor. Less than a handful held seats in state legislatures, and only a very small number sat on city councils and municipal bodies. Of course, one must be careful in characterizing the South, black and white, in monolithic terms, even in 1965. For example, 43% of adult Southern blacks had managed to register to vote. This included 69% in Tennessee, 63% in Florida, and 58% in Texas, the high numbers there. These states would not fall under the special provisions of the Voting Rights Act. Rather, it was the situation in Mississippi, 6.7% of blacks registered. Alabama, 23% of blacks registered. Louisiana, 32%. South Carolina, 39%. Georgia, 44%. Virginia, 45%. And North Carolina, 46%, all a minority of African Americans who could, by age, vote. It was these states that demanded the strongest federal measures to overcome the remaining obstacles of disfranchisement and the effects that lingered from them. Though much had been done to achieve citizenship by 1965, the South had a long way to go before its black residents entered the political mainstream and shared power with whites. A second consideration to note is how much was expected from the right to vote. Like other groups seeking the suffrage before them, most notably women, African Americans overestimated the power of the ballot to solve a host of deeply entrenched economic and social problems. Because white Southerners had spent so much time, energy, and ingenuity developing schemes to keep blacks away from the ballot boxes, it is not surprising that African Americans prize the right to vote as a central instrument for achieving freedom. Dr. King summed it up in a sentiment in a speech he gave in 1957, and I quote, "Give us the ballot," was the refrain of his speech. And he predicted that African Americans, once they had the ballot, would cast it to obtain their full rights as citizens, ensure justice, and guarantee representative government. 8 years later, this view received more earthy expression from one of King's top aides, James Bevel. During the protests at Selma, Alabama in March 1965, which paved the way for the passage of the Voting Rights Act, Bevel, referring to the obstructionist sheriff who battled demonstrators, a man by the name of Jim Clark, Bevel remarked, quote, "If we get out and work for voting rights, Jim Clark will be picking cotton with my father in about 2 years." Sheriff Clark did get voted out of office following passage of the Voting Rights Act, but Dr. King's more sweeping hopes for the ballot turned out to be less attainable. Third, it should be mentioned that African Americans adopted a dual approach to re-enfranchisement. And I say re-enfranchisement because you may remember in the period after the Civil War, African Americans first got the right to vote with military reconstruction acts and the passage of the 15th Amendment. In this period of time we're talking about, African Americans adopted a dual approach toward re-enfranchisement during what we call the Second Reconstruction, the first one being after the Civil War. One course of action emphasized traditional notions of the significance of the right to vote. From this perspective, blacks demanded suffrage on the same basis that other individual citizens exercised it, regardless of race. Toward this end, African American suffragists committed themselves to accepting the established rules of electoral politics and sought to improve their fortunes as they perceived other disfranchised Americans had done. While this approach did not foreclose a conception of politics as a means for advancing black goals collectively as a race of people, its focus on achieving equal rights under a colorblind constitution underscored conventional thinking about the franchise as a civic duty conferred on and exercised by individual citizens. So the emphasis was on individual rights. The other notion of black suffrage assumed a more radical cast. The first measure of the black suffrage was more associated with what the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, had in mind. The second was more closely identified with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. This vision of political freedom centered on the ballot as a means of transforming existing electoral institutions rather than merely gaining access to them. Its proponents viewed the suffrage not as an end in itself, but as a tool for organizing local communities. Through voter registration drives, SNCC members hoped to identify indigenous leaders who would then mobilize their friends and neighbors to address the issues directly affecting them. Their brand of participatory democracy called for a high level of collective, not individual, involvement in determining public policy. In SNCC's scheme of community-oriented decision-making, political governance signified more than the rights of individuals to cast an unfettered vote. It meant the power of the group to define and execute its own agenda. These competing conceptions of enfranchisement nevertheless shared a fundamental point of agreement. As African Americans engaged in their freedom struggle, they considered politics a crucial vehicle for obtaining liberation from white supremacy for blacks as a group. Uniting to gain admission into the established political system, they hoped to transform it by their participation. Thus, the civil rights movement did not function merely as an individual political enterprise, but as a collective struggle. It is important to emphasize that the Voting Rights Act, from its very inception, recognized the collective nature of the black experience with disfranchisement. The law was based on the premise that litigation by individual plaintiffs, which is what the NAACP and the government had done, was inadequate to remedy widespread disfranchisement. The measure attracted extensive support in Congress and the nation precisely because of awareness that Southern blacks as a group, a racial classification, had long been denied equal political access. Rather than aiming at individual examples of discriminatory behavior and offering remedies on an individual basis, the Voting Rights Act assumed that African Americans as a group, and we're talking predominantly about African Americans living in the South, which at that time was slightly more than half of African Americans in country. It assumed that African Americans as a group had been victimized by literacy tests and other discriminatory devices. Therefore, the Voting Rights Act provided coverage through a formula that calculated whether state electoral laws improperly kept the majority of eligible blacks from registering or voting. Given the extent of political disfranchisement in the pre-voting rights era, the lofty faith in the curative power of the ballot and the different agendas of suffragists, how should we evaluate what difference did the Voting Rights Act make? What has occurred since 1965? First, the good news. Reenfranchisement was accompanied by remarkable increases among African Americans in political mobilization, competition for public office, and acquisition of a legitimacy long denied them. The states of Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Virginia, and portions of North Carolina not only had to discard their use of literacy tests, the main block against black voting, but they also were subject to the imposition of federal registrars when the government deemed it, and supervision by the federal government over changes in their electoral laws. These were the so-called special provisions of the Voting Rights Act, which applied only to those 7 states. The Voting Rights Act applies in general throughout the United States, but in general, basically it says that you can't discriminate against blacks for a variety of means. It's only in these states of the South that they are watched over by the federal government, particularly the Justice Department and the federal court in Washington. Within 4 years after passage of the landmark 1965 law, about 3/5, somewhere around 60%, of eligible black adults succeeded in registering to vote in the 7 southern states originally covered under the special provision. Mississippi provides the model. An amazing transformation occurs in Mississippi, which was always considered the worst of the worst. All the other southern states would remark, "Thank God for Mississippi," whenever they were criticized, because Mississippi was always worse in whatever index you might choose, education, literacy, poverty, or whatever. In Mississippi alone, the black registration figure soared dramatically from 6% in 1964 to 60% in 1968. And after 1965, the gap between the ratio of white and black registration in these states, as well as turnout in the polls, shrunk considerably, so that there was a negligible difference between white and black registration and turnout. That's the good news. However, civil rights advocates discovered that whites entrenched in power did not intend to relinquish it easily, which is one of the long history of race in this country. In fact, even after passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and its successive renewals, these special provisions have to be renewed. Its successive renewals in 1970, that was for 5 years, 1975, another 5 years, then they jumped to 7 years in 1982, and then they jumped to 25 years. Most recently, it should have been renewed in 2007, but it actually was renewed in 2006. The struggle over political participation has continued in the South, not so much over voter registration, but in different forms. The major point of contention after 1965 no longer centered on voter registration, but on voter dilution, the dilution of votes through different kinds of electoral systems that would disadvantage minorities like African Americans. From the late 1960s through the beginning of this century, the remnants of the civil rights movement fought to defeat electoral rules that diminished the strengths of black ballots. Some of these obstacles had existed before the Voting Rights Act. Others were fashioned after 1965 to deprive the newly enfranchised of fair representation on municipal, state, and federal governing bodies. What were these procedures? Things like at-large elections, which tend to submerge minorities into a larger majority, instead of single-member districts, which give minorities more voting power if they can vote in more narrowly drawn areas. These kinds of procedures, which were a long history in the South and areas of the North, but were also used after 1965 to dilute the possibility of extensive black voting power, meant that in racially polarized contests, and in the South, political contests remained racially polarized, meaning the majority of whites voted for white candidates, the majority of blacks voted for black candidates. And since whites outnumbered blacks in every state, it meant that whites would continue to be elected. It existed throughout most of the South. The chances of minorities winning office in an at-large system were small, if not impossible. In addition, white-controlled legislatures and assemblies had the power to reapportion these bodies and redistrict them in a manner that minimized the impact of the black electorate. Mississippi, even though it had a majority now of blacks voting, Mississippi was one of these places that redistricted the black vote so that it was very much diluted in power. They did so by fracturing contiguous black populations, particularly along the Mississippi Delta, where blacks were concentrated. You could have made one significant district, congressional district. Instead, rather than going horizontally, they went vertically, breaking the delta where blacks were concentrated into several different areas in which whites dominated. Or they could cluster a large portion of black voters into one district where they held a majority. They might get one black representative, but reduce their potential power by not scattering them over two districts where they might have had sufficient strength to elect an additional candidate. And these were all done deliberately with the idea of trying now to reduce the possible power of the ballot. Let me tangentially say here, how does Montana figure into all of this? First of all, as you probably know a lot more about it than I studied it just a little bit coming down here. The black population of Montana is minuscule. The figure I got from, I think, the 2000 census, that it's about 0.3% of the total state population. So it's very, very small. So obviously, in Montana, African Americans and their voting rights are not, a significant question. But there is another minority group that's a little larger in population, and that is, of course, American Indians. In 1975, when the Voting Rights Act was renewed, provisions were added to that act that covered so-called language minorities. That means Americans whose basic language, first language, was in something other than English. And if these language minorities, oftentimes poor, had a higher illiteracy rate, meaning not illiteracy in their own language, but illiteracy in English. If their illiteracy rate was higher than the national average, right? Okay, so two things have to happen. You have to have a significant language minority, and their illiteracy rate has to be higher than the national average. You are now covered under the Voting Rights Act. Thus, two counties in Montana, Bighorn and Rosebud, came under this renewal of the Voting Rights Act. And what was required? They didn't get all the privileges as the southern states had. They didn't have to submit their laws, which were changed, state laws which were changed in any way to Washington, and they couldn't get federal registrars in. But the law required the counties, and it's not just Montana, this happens to Hispanics in Florida, a couple of counties there, New York City, Brooklyn, New York, where there are Hispanic majorities there as well. The law required the counties to provide language assistance for tribal members who speak Cheyenne. That was the law. I can't tell you how well it's implemented, but that's the law. Also, more recently, the American Civil Liberties Union has used other sections, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which again is a more general section. It's under these sections that you can get at redistricting and at-large elections that might dilute votes. The ACLU has brought cases here in Montana to challenge redistricting plans in the state. I think have been successful. Though such plans don't come under what's called Section 5, and that's what applies to the southern states. In Montana, one of the problems apparently is that 80% of Indians vote in tribal elections only, which are not subject to the Voting Rights Act. 20% vote in state and national elections, which are subject to the Voting Rights Act. But I think there has been some progress made from what I gather. In 2005, there were 6 Indian state representatives in the state legislature in Montana and 2 state senators. And from what I gather, some of these Indian officials have been conducting voter registration drives and organizing under the Voting Rights Act, which again shows its effect even in places which one would not have predicted. Starting in 1969, the United States Supreme Court agreed that the Voting Rights Act could be used to challenge electoral arrangements like the at-large elections and redistricting that were intended to or had the effect of diluting the African American vote. The majority of the Supreme Court decided that the 1965 law was not simply a voter registration statute, which in many ways the country had believed when it was passed, but also applied to protecting the value of black ballots cast. Thus, systems of representation that operated to handicap African Americans had to be reconfigured to allow blacks the opportunity to compete successfully for electoral office. Having obtained the ability to register and vote, African Americans turned their sights toward elections of blacks to public office. The number of black elected officials throughout the South, and here I'm not just talking about the 7 southern states, I'm talking about the 11 ex-Confederate states, has skyrocketed since 1965. And I'm just talking about the South now, not the North and the West. The latest figures, which really go back to 2001, show that the leap has gone from 75 black elected officials in 1965 in the South to over 9,000 in 2001. The majority of black elected officials nationwide are located in the South. As a result of the increased availability of the suffrage and the intense struggle it had taken to secure, black Southerners naturally looked to members of their own race to represent their interests. This was especially true in areas with large numbers of blacks among the eligible voters, where the chances of electing a black candidate were high. Just as the acquisition of the ballot furnished a necessary step toward achieving first-class citizenship, so did the election of blacks serve as a badge of equality. Quote, "A race of people excluded from public office," a black political leader in South Carolina asserted, "will always be second class." Black public officials have achieved some notable accomplishments. Their candidacies stimulated increased black political mobilization, and their elections have provided significant minority access to city halls and county courthouses where most black elected officials hold office, generally at the local level. They also succeeded in opening up jobs and allowing government contracts and allotting government contracts to their black constituents, improving the quality of municipal services when none had existed before, and reducing racist rhetoric and violence. Reaping tangible and symbolic gains, they helped tear down the psychological and physical walls that kept blacks in confinement. A retired worker in Tuskegee, Alabama, clearly recognized the difference the ballot made when he said, quote, "Everything's better. In the old days, before black officials ran the county, most black people steered clear of white enclaves. They used to arrest you over there if you went through, but not anymore." Still, the gains have fallen short of the needs. In most cities and counties of the South, black elected officials have been in a minority and could not deliver political rewards without the cooperation of white colleagues. In rural black belt areas where blacks controlled a majority of government positions, they lack the economic resources to affect significantly the material conditions of the impoverished population. Even in the region's major cities, such as Atlanta, Birmingham, and New Orleans, where black mayors have and still govern, economic power remained largely in white hands. Blacks have the ballot box, an Atlanta newspaper editor admitted, and whites have the money. Still, the widespread participation of black voters in the South altered the racist outlook of the Democratic Party. With the growth of the Republican Party in the South and its appeal among conservative white voters, Democratic politicians scrambled for black votes to compensate for white flight from their ranks. In return for this support, white Southern Democratic lawmakers increasingly took positions favorable to their black constituents. And that's a major, major change in the lifetime in which I'm talking about. The shift in backing for civil rights legislation was especially striking. In 1985 and 1982, Southern white Democratic congressmen, overwhelming majority of whom had voted against the 1965 Voting Rights Act, now lined up solidly behind renewal of the Voting Rights Act, reversing the situation of a decade earlier, when the overwhelming majority had opposed the measure. These notable successes aside, race continues to endure as a significant force in American politics. Public opinion surveys indicate that blacks and whites disagree sharply over a broad range of policy issues, especially those that deal with federal efforts to reverse the social and economic effects of past racial discrimination and seem to give preferential treatment to blacks, in other words, affirmative action. Of course, this split is not a new development. From the very beginning, racial polarization accompanied reenfranchisement. The emergence of Southern blacks into the electorate initially sparked a political counter-mobilization of Southern whites to sign up to vote. While blacks flocked into the Democratic Party and joined while blacks flocked into the Democratic Party in the South, whites deserted to the Republican Party and joined newly transplanted Northerners to turn it into a competitive, if not dominant force in the traditionally one-party region. So the South, in my lifetime, has become a two-party region. When I was growing up and maturing, it was only a one-party area with the Democratic Party. The sharp racial division at the polls existed in local contests where black and white candidates directly competed against each other. In presidential elections, a majority of white Southerners, and this is an incredible statistic, in presidential elections, a majority of white Southerners have not supported a Democratic presidential candidate, and that includes Bill Clinton, since 1964, in contrast to the overwhelming mass of black voters. Developments over the past decade have signaled very mixed messages for the continued development of African Americans into the center of the American political system. During the 1990s, the news was good. Black representation in Congress initially jumped 54%, largely because of cases that were redistricting legislatures and so forth. It jumped 54% from 26 blacks in Congress to 40 blacks in Congress, mostly in the House of Representatives. Furthermore, in 1992, African American voters provided President Bill Clinton's margin of victory in 7 states: Georgia, Louisiana from the South, Maryland, Michigan, New Jersey, Ohio, and another border state, Tennessee. Also in 1992, Carol Moseley Braun, a Democrat from Illinois, became the first black woman ever elected to the United States Senate. Overall, in 1992, the number of black women in Congress stood at 10, a gain of 6. This increase in the number of black women reflected the growing prominence of women in the electoral process, both as voters and candidates. During the 1980s, the number of black female office holders doubled, and their growth rate helped exceed that of black men. The civil rights movement, why did this happen? The civil rights movement had empowered black women who played a critical, though often unsung role in the freedom struggle. While men held the top leadership positions, women both initiated and provided grassroots support for the protests that transformed the South and the nation. Without the courage, commitment, and vision of legions of ordinary housewives and workers who boycotted, marched, sat in, and went to prison, the civil rights movement could not have been launched and sustained. And the movement inspired pride and encouraged standards of political participation in women that subsequently carried over to the electoral arena. However, 1992 may have marked a high water mark. From 1992 until the midterm election of 2006, very recently, the partisan shifts that vaulted Republicans into control of Congress and the presidency diminished the power of African American members of Congress and their white allies. Black representatives who had been building up seniority and positioning themselves to chair key congressional committees had to sit on the sidelines with the rest of the Democratic minority. Senator Moseley Braun was defeated after one term in office, and her bid for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2004, you've probably forgotten about that, never got off the ground. She was the second prominent black woman to seek the nomination. Shirley Chisholm, back in 1972, a northern black woman from Brooklyn, was the first. She didn't have any greater success. In addition, the United States Supreme Court, which in our my lifetime, your lifetime starts later. Your lifetime starts when a lot of these reversals were taking place. The Supreme Court, which had been at the forefront of racial change in this country, which had done so much to expand racial equality in this country and black political advancement, during the 1990s began to halt black advances. In a case originating from North Carolina, a case called Shaw versus Reno, the Supreme Court condemned the drawing of congressional district lines in a shape it considered contorted and bizarre for the sole purpose of creating majority black constituencies and therefore maximizing black electoral prospects. Many states thought under the Voting Rights Act they had to draw districts, even if those districts were not shaped in a fairly reasonable, what was considered fairly reasonable manner. In North Carolina, this district looked like a snake. It went across the state to cover key areas where there was a large black population. I actually lived on the edge of this district I wish I had lived in it because my representative would have represented my views a little better, but didn't. So they looked at this district, this strange shape, and said, no, this can't be constitutional because it was set up in this fashion just on the basis of race, the argument was, to get African Americans this seat. Though this Carolina district was actually fairly well integrated. I mean, in the popular mind, it looked like they drew this district with 90% blacks. That wasn't the case. This was a well-integrated district. The black population was a little over 50%. And actually, if you took the actual registered voters, blacks were not in the majority. It only had a slight black majority. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who was a very pivotal vote in many of these cases while she was on the court in the 90s, she dismissed it as an example. She called this district political apartheid. Something, I guess, reminding us of South Africa, that there had to be a district for blacks, and of course, whites had the rest of the state. Her thinking reflected the rising opposition to affirmative action programs that granted racial preference. She thought of this as an affirmative action program that took race in to advantage blacks. Of course, no whites were getting hurt. Whites could still vote, and overwhelming majority of whites in North Carolina were represented by whites. She was also concerned with so-called racial gerrymandering of voting districts that allegedly ghettoized, she said, and polarized the electorate. Her argument, however, ignored the fact that the creation of such majority-minority districts, that's what they were called, minority districts, but in which blacks were a majority, limited in number, and they were fairly limited in number as they are and can be given the population of these states, has worked not to exclude African Americans as in South Africa, but to include more minority representatives in government. The very opposite of keeping anyone separated. Indeed, the fashioning of such districts was devised to remedy the discriminatory situation that prevailed in the apartheid South before the Voting Rights Act, in which racially polarized voting by whites virtually excluded African Americans from electing representatives of their own choice. Despite similar rulings striking down majority-minority districts in Georgia and Texas, the Supreme Court, if you want to find a ray of hope here, the Supreme Court has not altogether eliminated race as a legitimate factor in legislative redistricting. In 2001, the court ruled that race was not an improper consideration as long as it was not, quote, the dominant and controlling one. The case involved the same district. That they could never, this case kept going back and back as they kept trying to tinker with the district, and no drawing of it seemed to hold water judicially. Had tried to redraw this thing several times. Finally, on this occasion, in a bare 5-4 decision, Justice Stephen Breyer, a Clinton appointee, contended that it wasn't race that the legislature had taken into account in drawing the district. It was the legitimate concern for the Democratic majority of the legislature to get more Democrats elected. Now, the fact that blacks, of course, everyone knew were going to vote Democratic, but it passed muster. But there are problems with this, obviously. African Americans, presumably rather than race, was the predominant concerns in the minds of the Tar Heel legislators who created the district. And remember, it's 5-4. Justice O'Connor, who now is in the majority, she was a swing vote. Justice O'Connor isn't there anymore. Replacing her is Chief Justice Roberts, who was deemed to be more conservative and probably is. And Justice Alito now has come on the court. So it's a very iffy situation about what's going to happen in these kinds of cases. But that may be exaggerated, the concern about it, because some African Americans and their allies have questioned, and it's a legitimate question, have questioned whether creating more electoral districts for blacks only to win will accomplish the larger goal of progressive social change, which of course is what those who are active in the civil rights movement and other movements were about. And why is this? They cite the inroads in creating these districts, largely of blacks. What's happened, these blacks have come from traditionally white Democratic districts, which have then made it possible, you can get two black districts, but what used to be white Democratic districts are now white Republican districts, because the Democrats don't have the kind of support from African Americans that they need, because African Americans have been put in this other district. These progressive critics of majority-minority districts charge that drawing new boundary lines to create districts in favor of black candidates has come at the expense of moderate and liberal white Democrats, who are more likely than Republicans to support black goals. They ask whether African Americans will be better off if, in managing to elect a few more representatives of color, they find themselves part of an ineffectual minority political party. And I think these are valid concerns. However, they do create the false impression that Democratic electoral losses have resulted mainly from the redistricting requirements of the Voting Rights Act. The rise of republicanism in the South is really part of a larger trend that precedes the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Race surely has played a part in this realignment, but so have economic and demographic changes in the electorate. Cultural conflicts centering on family and religion have also caused defections from the once predominant Democratic Party. White Southerners, in effect, have not really become more conservative, if you think about it, since 1965. Rather, they have come to identify more closely with the Republicans as the conservative party than with the Democrats. They've changed their name more than their views. Certainly, one would not argue that because large numbers of white Southern Democrats abandoned their traditional party and switched their loyalty to the Republican Party, that Congress should not have extended civil and political rights to African Americans in the first place. No one would argue that. You wouldn't take it to its logical conclusion. Whatever the results of these assaults on the continued extension of black political representation, African American political strategists, I think, at this point, must explore new avenues for making progress. You know, given the political demography of the United States, in which African Americans are now a declining proportion of the population, African Americans are no longer the second largest minority in this country. They are no longer the first minority. Hispanics have just edged out African Americans. So given the declining proportion of the population, the possibilities for establishing the construction of a substantial number of new congressional districts that favor the election of black candidates is limited. I mean, we've about reached the number that you could probably create from race-conscious remedies. There may be further chances for expansion at the state and local levels, but these too are restricted. You know, concentrating on redistricting is going to be ultimately limited. Most of what can be done to create majority-minority districts has already been accomplished. Moreover, outnumbered in every state legislature, which is, you know, going to be the case for certainly lifetimes and generations, African Americans and their allies, their white allies, have to figure out ways to establish meaningful coalitions and devise electoral techniques that link their constituencies with those sharing mutual interests. something of what Dr. King had in mind back in the 60s. This is also what Professor Lani Guinier, I don't know if you remember, well, you don't remember, but maybe you've heard who she was. Back in 1993, Lani Guinier was nominated by Bill Clinton to head the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, the most important civil rights post in the government. Her nomination was ambushed in Congress and withdrawn, rather timidly, I would argue, by President Clinton. She was a law professor and also a civil rights attorney who had participated in many, many civil rights cases. She was an advocate of finding innovative ways, many of them unfamiliar to us in this kind of two-party electoral system, but she was an advocate of finding innovative ways of sharing political power along racial lines and becoming more inclusive with respect to electoral representation. She had a series of plans which would have worked not just to have black representation, but in effect to make black representation count by helping to form coalitions with like-minded people on specific issues. Well, for taking these positions, she was labeled by her opponents as a quota queen, the opposite of what she was trying to say. But it was a disturbing sign of how far racist discourse had once again dominated the body politic in the 1990s. As a renewal of the Voting Rights Act just last year suggests, there's a great deal to be proud of, but the fact that it was renewed suggests that more remains to be done. Despite limitations placed on legislative redistricting by the court, the number of African American elected officials nationwide has continued to increase, though the growth rate, as you would expect, has declined to a trickle. The Congressional Black Caucus remains steady at 43 members. Once again, a black U.S. Senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, is in the Senate, and his star is on the rise, as we know, in the Democratic Party as a contender for the presidential nomination in 2008. By the way, we still have not had a U.S. Senator, black U.S. Senator from the South. Harold Ford, who ran in Tennessee, mounted an impressive race, but he lost. And in that race was injected by his opponent. In the year 2000, as I said before, the number of African Americans elected nationally exceeded 9,000. One of them today is Deval Patrick, who had been the Assistant Attorney General in Clinton's administration. He came to office after they rejected Lani Guinier. Deval Patrick took that position. He was recently, in 2006, elected governor of Massachusetts. Only the second African American since the passage of the Voting Rights and in the 20th century who has been elected a governor from any state. The other was from the state of Virginia. The most impressive gains in elected representatives who are black occurred in Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas. Most of them Voting Rights Act states. Texas wasn't. Mississippi, I can't say thank God for Mississippi anymore in the same way. In Mississippi, the state that had the lowest number of blacks registered to vote in 1965, had the highest number of black elected officials of any state in the nation. In Mississippi, there are something like 900 black elected officials in the state. Most recently, and this may be a trend, we have to wait and see. Historians can't predict trends. We can tell you what happened in the past, but we don't know what's going to happen in the future. Sometimes we're not sure what's happening in the present. Most recently, the 2006 congressional elections returned the Democratic Party to control Congress, which now means that there are now veterans, Democratic black lawmakers in the House such as Charles Rangel of New York City, John Conyers of Detroit, Benny Thompson of Jackson, Mississippi, who's on the chairing the Homeland Security Committee. They have become chairmen of important legislative committees. But their power rests on the ability of the Democrats to maintain control in Congress. Notwithstanding these gains at the polls, the ballot has proven a necessary, clearly one would never say that there should not have been a contest for the ballot. It was necessary, but it's been an insufficient tool for achieving racial equality in practice as well as in theory. And black political power is wider than it is deep. Entry into politics has had limited effectiveness in relieving the economic distress that blacks endure disproportionately to their presence in the population. The 2000 census report shows that the median income for blacks was $29,000 plus, compared with $46,000 plus for whites. Approximately 22.5% of African Americans lived in poverty, nearly double the national rate of 11.7%, while only 7.8% of non-Hispanic whites lived in poverty. Poverty rates were the highest in the South, where African Americans make up today over 54% of the population. So the economic returns have been real, particularly for middle-class African Americans, those who had the education to take advantage of the civil rights movement, but have left enormous numbers of blacks in the wake of poverty. And we saw this, of course, very dramatically. In 2005, it took a hurricane on the Gulf Coast to expose the depths of poverty, third world poverty, in the city and the surroundings of New Orleans, which of course does have a black mayor, but has one of the highest rates of poverty in the country. African Americans also lagged behind educationally. In 1999, almost twice as many whites than blacks received a bachelor's degree, a BA, 28 to 15%. Among blacks, more women than men earned at least a bachelor's degree, 16% as opposed to 14%. For whites, this was reversed. More men received a bachelor's degree, 31%, than women. How do you explain part of this? Well, this is the tragedy. The figures for African American men reflect a tragic reality experienced by black youths and young adults. African Americans have a 6 times greater chance of going to prison during their lifetime than whites, and can expect to serve longer sentences for the same offenses. And a large share of these imprisoned African American men come in their late teens and in their 20s, when they should be starting to vote. More than 28% of African American men can expect to be incarcerated over their lifetime, while white men have only a 4% chance of imprisonment. In 1996, African Americans represented 30% of all convicted federal offenders, despite the fact that they made up only 13% of the population. In the decade between 1985 and 1995, the percentage of African Americans under correctional supervision increased 81%. A lot of this having to do with drug laws. These figures have serious implications for black voting rights, specifically those of African American men. For many states have laws on the books barring ex-felons from voting, something we now call felon disfranchisement. In fact, felon disfranchisement and proposals which come out of places like Georgia recently for uniform voter identification cards have become the modern day equivalent of the poll tax. The courts in Georgia, by the way, ruled that a state identification card, a uniform state identification card, was not constitutional and threw it out, that it did act disproportionately on minorities. If the vision embedded in the Voting Rights Act is finally to succeed, then black ballots alone are not enough. I mean, that's clear. You can calculate, an accountant can do the cost effectiveness here. And there have been many wonderful gains if the modern day equivalent to Rip Van Winkle had gone to sleep, in 1965 in Mississippi and awakened in 2007, he would not really understand the world that he was seeing. We have to always keep that in mind, and I have to remind myself of that fact. But if the vision embedded in the Voting Rights Act, and the vision is for empowerment, the vision is the end of white supremacy. Martin Luther King was very much aware of that. Then black ballots enough have to be, once again, found lacking. And as the presidential election of 2000, this is your lifetime, although many of you could not vote. As the presidential election of 2000 showed, the South, and Florida in particular, still employs the means to make black ballots count less or not at all. The 2004 election suggests that the problem is not just regional, but national in scope, as the many reports that come out of Ohio demonstrate in terms of discouraging black voters and absolute fraud. The history of black suffrage in this nation warns us. There's lessons here. And the lesson is not to be complacent. The lesson is the struggle is ongoing. The lesson is Frederick Douglass's. Power concedes nothing without a struggle. It never has and it never will. The history of black suffrage in this nation warns us that whenever black Americans make significant strides in political participation, white opponents devise overt and covert ways to diminish those gains. Black Americans have been down this road before and have demonstrated that sheer persistence and creative strategies can yield triumphs. If they are once again to achieve success, African Americans will have to mobilize their communities, find common ground with others who share similar objectives, and establish coalitions that bring their voices more fully to bear in the arena of national government. After all, the long history of African Americans battling for suffrage demonstrates that the power of the right to vote comes not from the ritual of individuals routinely marking their ballots, but from the purposeful, collective action of an engaged electorate. 100 years ago, in 1907, 40 years after emancipation and enfranchisement in this country, the political future looked very bleak to African Americans. You're taking courses in Mike Mayer's course. He talked about Jim Crow and its development today. Well, you know that by 1907, Jim Crow was in place. Blacks had lost the right to vote 40 years after the first Reconstruction. 40 years since the second, over previous decades. I'm sorry, after the first, over the previous decades, blacks had virtually lost their voting rights and their opportunity to hold elective office. It is tempting to suggest, and some did, and some have, it is tempting to suggest that a century later, and 4 decades after reenfranchisement, the Voting Rights Act, we are, in 2007, on the verge of a similar phenomenon. don't get nervous, I don't think. Whatever similarities exist, and there are some, and whatever retrenchment still may be in store. This may be 2006, may be the beginning of a new era, or it may just be an interlude in a much longer process. We don't know. But whatever similarities exist, the gains, and I'm convinced of this, unlike the period after the Civil War and Reconstruction, the gains accompanying the Voting Rights Act will not be obliterated. The right to vote is under siege, but mainly at the margins. I think the center definitely will hold. Truthfully, I would be more comfortable in offering this opinion if in the years ahead we saw what has been sorely missing in the years past. That is a revival or reinvention of the civil rights movement. As the events of the 1950s and 1960s proved, Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a struggle. It never has and never will. We desperately need another round of grassroots organizing and mass mobilization, combined with a responsive federal government to make political and economic equality a meaningful reality and not merely wishful thinking. After all, the rekindling of the civil rights movement is our best hope of carrying out the changes envisioned by those like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who we celebrate today, who fought and died to pass the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Thank you. Question? Sure. If you have any questions, yes. Sir.
I have a question. I thought what you said about the power of voting, not coming from ritual, but the purposeful engagement, I thought that was right. Now, in Ohio, there was a story yesterday where they said that they can't get enough poll workers. Even in the places where in 2004 there was not enough voting machines and all sorts of things were out of shape. So if 2004 isn't a wake-up call to those people who lived in those precincts where things were totally out of whack to make them engage in 2006, I mean, something else seems like it's got to be brought to bear here.
Well, I think 2006 did demonstrate that people were listening. Not so much on, I mean, there are a couple of problems here, and one is the voting machines. In our age of cyber technology, more and more going to electronic computer-based voting machines, which on one level sounds, well, why not? We do everything else these days with microchips and so forth, but there are real problems, as many computer experts, and I'm not one of them, can tell you. Part of it is you can't always have a paper trail with these machines. Hackers who are ingenious, and they, I'm sure the Republicans and the Democrats both have hackers, might upset the votes. Make votes disappear. It may very well have happened. So that's one problem. I favor the old, I don't think it's that old-fashioned, the lever things. I don't know why we can't use lever voting. It leaves a record. It's not hard. You can do it easily. So that's one issue. The other issue is, intimidation. In minority communities, black, Hispanic, or whatever, if you have police around the polling booths, and this is what happened in Florida, the police present in black neighborhoods, it's going to make people who don't necessarily trust the police think twice about going to the polls. Then you could slow up or not be prepared. Vast lines of people outside a polling booth. And they tended to be in minority areas and in poor areas. But in 2006, the Democrats, who were the victims, I think, mostly of these problems in 2000 and 2004, mobilized, sent lawyers, sent people, as many as they could, to watch these areas. And you've got to be vigilant. Vigilance, liberty and vigilance go hand in hand. So this is an ongoing problem, but it doesn't seem that's a problem that would be all that hard to resolve. But we, need to wait and see. Any other? Yes.
Considering what you said,
Oh, let's take this one first, and we'll go up there second. Oh, take that one first, and we'll go down here.
Opinion about an issue I've heard raised concerning natives, Americans in Montana. When they get into the state legislature as members of another sovereign nation or tribe, they could be in the position of voting on issues which they themselves would not be subject to those laws that they vote on. Do you consider that a legitimate issue or an issue raised by anti-Native Americans?
I'll have to cop out. I really don't know enough about it, to answer it. I see what you're saying, that because they're in sovereign tribes.
For instance, fish and game laws.
Right.
They wouldn't be subject to the same laws as somebody who is not a tribal. Right.
What do you think?
I think it goes both ways. I do see an issue when you're going to vote on a law which you yourself are not subject to. There is a legitimate issue there, but there are so few Native Americans that actually make it to the legislature.
Yeah, I mean, in practice, it doesn't. Well, but it could be balance of power, I suppose, on any, in any close vote. Again, the statistics I saw that most natives in the state don't participate in the state and federal elections. They're participating more in their tribal elections. But it's hard to make these judgments, except if you look back at history. The history, if African Americans and white Americans have had a tortured history, I don't need to tell you that the history between Native Americans, Indians, and the rest of American society has been perhaps even more tortured. So I'm not, particularly impressed, just as a gut reaction, forgetting about the legal aspects of it, as a gut reaction, I'm not particularly mortified if this presents a conflict. It doesn't mortify me. I don't think it's going to be a real problem for the state of Montana. Now, legally, that may be a different issue. I don't know. But it doesn't bother me, frankly.
I'm actually hoping that other people are wondering this question. Considering what you said about racial polarization politically and black population now being the second minority behind the Latino population, do you think, and I know this is a difficult question, do you think that a black candidate for presidency has a shot?
Great question. I think it was about 10 years ago, I was giving a talk about the voting and ballots and what difference and so forth. It was really a talk about women suffrage and black suffrage and so forth. And I predicted then, again, it still may come true, but I predicted then that if we were going to have a black president or a woman president, or I suppose a black woman president could be, if we were going to have one of those combinations, it would probably be a candidate running on the Republican ticket, not the Democratic ticket. And my thinking there was a Republican woman and a Republican black would take on more legitimacy and credibility under the Republicans who are seen, as the conservative, traditional, and so forth. That once they are labeled with the Democrats, the L word, not the one that's on Showtime, one that's maybe even worse today. Well, I don't know, Montana, I don't know. Liberalism, liberals. That word would be very, very hard to overcome. So I thought that would, be the case. And it still may be the case, because we obviously haven't elected a black or a woman. But now you ask the question, because this year, we're 2 years away from the election, and we've already got the candidates lining up. And of course, the supposed two top candidates in the Democratic Party, the Republicans don't seem to have spawned either an African American or a woman this year, unlike, I forgot what year it was, when Elizabeth Dole, maybe it was 2000, was looking at the presidency. So we've got Hillary Clinton and we've got a Barack Obama. I don't know if you heard this today. Joe Biden, who has now declared his candidate, said that, and he's a Democrat and he's a supporter of Barack Obama, not for president since he's running. He said that Barack Obama is the first African-American candidate for president who's articulate and clean. Well, you know, if Biden is saying this, this is a problem for a black candidate. But if you were asking me about history and trends, I would say Obama, and I'd say this about Hillary, don't have a great chance. If you ask me about this in terms of, you know, what I've seen in history, but history doesn't have iron laws to it. If it did, you know, why study it? It wouldn't be, the social sciences would study it, and we would, you know, we'd be out of work, but it wouldn't be as interesting. You know, this is a year where the Republicans have their own, 2008 will be a year where the Republicans don't really have, well, you can count John McCain, but, you know, John McCain is going to have problems, a variety of problems when he comes under closer scrutiny, I think. Rudy Giuliani, who always looks good from afar. Rudy Giuliani reminds me of another New York City mayor, John Lindsay, back in the 60s. Everybody loved John Lindsay, you know, out of New York City. And then when they had a chance to see him, they didn't love him so much. And I think Rudy Giuliani is going to be in that category. He's not going to, you know, he's got problems for a Republican base if he wants to run. So I don't know that there's, you know, that kind of a Republican candidate who, you know, is so strong. So the Democrats have a better chance. So this, you know, this improves people like Clinton and Obama. You know, Hillary's got problems, obviously, because there's still those high negatives that she gets, you know, and all the Clinton haters in this country. She's actually been a tame, moderate, effective senator from New York. Hardly, you know, a firebrand, hardly even a liberal, actually. But that, you know, New York voters know it, but the nation may not know it. You know, Obama, who I think, and I haven't watched him as closely because he hasn't been visible as much. Obama is a very inspiring candidate. And I think, you know, if he were white, I would say put your money on him. But the fact he's black, you know, at least 25% of the country won't vote for him, won't vote for a black candidate. But I do think he's inspiring. He is the story of the American dream. He has a long history of being able to bring people together. He doesn't appear to be particularly threatening, but from what he says. I mean, he's threatening because he's black, but from what he says. But I don't know how well he'll stand up to the kind of crazy scrutiny we now put our candidates through. I don't know, you know. Somebody was spreading a rumor that he went to an Islamic fundamentalist school in Indonesia. It's not going to help him, you know, that Barack Obama sounds like Osama. Now, that can't help him that much. So you know, he's got some problems there, but I wouldn't count him out. I actually think, again, don't take this for much, I think that maybe neither Hillary nor Obama will get the Democratic nomination, and someone like John Edwards will. He was very appealing in 2004, at least when he was running for the nomination. Didn't get it. He did run for vice president, didn't seem to catch fire there. But the concerns, both about Clinton, not only as a woman, but, you know, she's seen as one of those, you know, feminist women. God help us, right? You know, one of those feminist women. So it's hard to, you know, to get rid of that notion. And Obama's, you know, experience, they say, right? He doesn't have much experience. You know, well, I mean, this works both ways. George Bush had no experience in foreign affairs, but you could say, well, look what he did. So I'm not sure that means anything. But when Rudy Giuliani runs, where have you heard anyone say, well, he doesn't have any experience? You know, New York City doesn't have its own foreign policy. Well, maybe it does, but I grew up in New York City, so. But no one says he's not experienced. You know, in some ways, he's less experienced than Obama, at least in the national stage. If you're going to have a black presidential candidate that succeeds, you're going to have someone who's purer than, you know, Caesar's wife, who's articulate, you know. Jesse Jackson's articulate, but they radiate different images, right? You know, and Jesse did rather well in 1988, running for the nomination. But you're going to have someone who breaks this path, you know, in a particular mold. They're going to have a style that's going to fit and alleviate, fit Americans' conceptions of a president, or what that may be now, God knows. But, you know, Jackie Robinson, when he integrated Major League Baseball, which was one of the great integration stories of the 20th century, he had to conform in a certain way. You know, there were other players who they wouldn't pick because they didn't look right, act right, and so forth. So I think Obama comes out of central casting for this, but whether he can overcome these other problems, you know, I don't know. But we have to see more of him. I want to see more of what he, you know, what he may stand for. But we're getting closer. We're certainly getting closer with a woman, I think. Probably closer to a woman than a male. You know, I think Colin Powell could have done reasonably, if he wanted to be, you know, he doesn't, smart on his part, he didn't want to. But I think he could have run in the Republican, you know, process, and I think he might have had a, you know, a decent shot. He's another kind, as he certainly has experience. People like Condoleezza Rice, you know, not my cup of tea, but there's your black woman running, but she also chooses not to run. So we are getting, you know, we are getting closer. Yes.
One of the things that's interesting about the Voting Rights Act is the reauthorization provision that requires that certain parts of it expire and that Congress may want to continue those rights reauthorized. And as you mentioned, it came up reauthorization again in 2006. And one of the things that Congress has done in previous iterations of reauthorization, particularly in 75 and 82, is to address issues that have come up either through the court system or in the practice of implementing the earlier provisions of voting rights and dealt with things like vote dilution. In 2006, it seemed like Congress had the opportunity to take care of or at least address issues that have vexed the courts. For example, you mentioned Shaw v. Reno and how often it bounces up and down between the lower and higher courts in the state legislature in North Carolina. To what extent did the Congress in 2006 take that opportunity to try to clarify some of those issues or to deal with some of the other problems that had come up in the years since, I guess, the reauthorization in 91?
Yeah. No, it's a very good question. And the answer is they didn't take the opportunity. I mean, part of it was a tremendous haste to get this thing ratified while they had a consensus. Because it should have been renewed in 2007. But you may know, because some of you might have gotten these emails, there was this email, early on in the 2000s, there were emails floating around saying that if the Voting Rights Act was not reauthorized, blacks would lose the right to vote. I mean, it was a real scare. And it's simply not true. The Voting Rights Act would have stayed in effect. It was these special provisions that really apply in particular cases. And I think early on, the various civil rights groups did want an early revival. I was surprised. If you would have asked me 2 years ago, I did not think that the Bush administration was going to get behind the Voting Rights Act in a simple renewal the way they did. I thought they were going to try to dilute it in the way that Presidents Nixon and Ford tried to dilute it before they then signed it. But I think because of the great disaffection, you know, whatever support the Republicans had from African Americans before 2000, and it was beginning to build and erode some of the Democratic support. I think the Republican Party, looking ahead, wanted to, you know, rally around the consensus and get it through. But there are a lot of technical questions and legal questions that have to be resolved. And to my understanding, they didn't make it into the into the renewal. But I was very surprised how quick and fast and early on that renewal came. But you're absolutely right. It was not, they did not take the advantage, which probably tells us something, again, about not the fragility of the right to vote. Clearly, we're not going back. I mean, so many things have changed in the United States since 1907 that we're not going back in that way. But there's a reluctance and a confusion about what to change in terms of electoral systems. You know, should we have more black representatives at the expense of white liberal Democrats? Or what? And I think even the Democrats are reluctant, you know, to get involved in that mess. But the fact that we still have it in its special provisions, I think, is important.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and thank you for coming out. And remember that Friday they're showing the Emmett Till documentary.
Good documentary. I've seen it, and that's a documentary that led to the reopening of the Justice Department's review of the murder of Emmett Till and new suspects after all these years. So is this the Beauchamp one? Oh, yeah, it's a great documentary. I would recommend it highly. Thank you for coming out and for staying.